Finally, this is the lecture I've been waiting for, the one where I get to introduce the structure of cumulative sentences, the syntax at the very heart of my approach to teaching writing. Of course, it's misleading to say that I'm about to introduce you to the cumulative syntax, since I've been peppering the preceding lectures with references to cumulatives and with examples of what they can do. If I haven't yet managed to clearly establish the form these sentences take, I bet I have managed to alert your ears to their characteristic rhythms. Just listen to a few of the cumulative sentences I've used in previous lectures. George was coming down in the telemark position, kneeling, one leg forward and bent, the other trailing, his sticks hanging like some insect's thin legs, kicking up puffs of snow, and finally the whole kneeling, trailing figure coming around in a beautiful right curve, crouching, the legs shot forward and back, the body leaning out against the swing, the sticks accenting the curve like points of light, all in a wild cloud of snow. He went to speak to Mrs. Bean, tiny among the pillows, her small toothless mouth open like an O, her skin stretched thin and white over her bones, her huge eye sockets and eyes in a fixed, infant-like stare, and her sparse white hair short and straggling over her brow. Out of breath from running, plopping into his chair quickly, dramatically, the young boy sat down at the table, its heavy oak surface covered by steaming dishes of food, only then looking around the room. Or they slept, the man simply collapsing on the bed, the woman first seeing what TV channels were available. He drove the car carefully, his shaggy hair whipped by the wind, his eyes hidden behind wraparound mirror shades, his mouth set in a grim smile, a .38 police special on the seat beside him, the corpse stuffed in the trunk. Here are a couple of new ones from Faulkner's Barn Burning. Again, he could not see, whirling. There was a face in a red haze, moon-like, bigger than the full moon, the owner of it half again his size. He leaping in the red haze toward the face, feeling no blow, feeling no shock when his head struck the earth, scrabbling up and leaping again, feeling no blow this time either, and tasting no blood, scrabbling up to see the other boy in full flight and himself already leaping into pursuit as his father's hand jerked him back, the harsh, cold voice speaking above him, "Go get in the wagon." Or another one from Faulkner. His father struck him with the flat of his hand on the side of the head, hard but without heat, exactly as he had struck the two mules at the store, exactly as he would strike either of them with any stick in order to kill a horsefly, his voice still without heat or anger. And here are a couple of sentences from Don DeLillo, starting with a great description of a laugh. He crossed his arms on his midsection, bent against the wall, laughing. It was a staccato laugh, building on itself, broadening in the end to a breathless gasp, the laughter that marks a pause in the progress of the world, the laughter we hear once in 20 years. And then a DeLillo description of wind. Some nights the wind never stops, beginning in a clean, shrill pitch that broadens and deepens to a careless and suspenseful force, rattling shutters, knocking things off balconies, creating a pause in one's mind, awaiting for the full force to hit. I love the sound of these sentences. I love the stop-and-go rhythms they set up with each syntactic step they take, moving us forward, preparing our ears for what will come next, just as they add to our knowledge of what came before. And the examples I've just read contain rhythms within rhythms, setting up parallels and repetitions, balancing sound against sound, the product not of conscious choice so much as it is the natural benefit of the cumulative syntax, itself a rhythm so powerful that it encourages us to find other rhythms within it. After a while, you can almost hear these rhythms coming, knowing that a free modifying phrase starting with a participle, usually an ing form of a verb, might come next, or an adverb such as an ly word, or a phrase started with a possessive pronoun, his or her or its, or a phrase that backtracks, picking up and repeating a word from the base clause before adding new information. In this way, we get cumulative rhythms such as the chef prepared the fish carefully, stuffing it with wild rice, sautéing it briefly, its sweet aroma blending smoothly with the other enticing odors in the kitchen, the fish becoming more than a food item, ascending to the status of art. Work with cumulative sentences, and soon their rhythms become seductive, urging us to keep adding modifying phrases, their very sound reminding us of the limitless detail and explanation we can add to each sentence we write. That we now know so much about the cumulative syntax is a tribute to the pioneering work of Francis Kristensen, an English professor at USC who in the 1960s stopped repeating received truths about what made for good writing and actually started looking at the way professional writers wrote. Kristensen, who died in 1970, was an incredibly influential rhetorician, and his impact on the teaching of writing has been profound, and much of his influence can be traced back to a single essay, A Generative Rhetoric of the Sentence, first published in College Composition and Communication back in 1963, and then republished in Kristensen's collection of essays, Notes Toward a New Rhetoric, six essays for teachers, published in 1967. What so distinguished Kristensen's approach to teaching writing was first the belief that writing should really matter, and second, that writing improves most obviously and most quickly when we add information to our sentences in free modifiers following or surrounding a base clause. When I say that Kristensen thought that writing really mattered, I mean that he saw sentences as means to a crucial end much more important than clarity or effectiveness. As he put it, quote, "The end is to enhance life, to give the self, the soul, body by wedding it to the world, to give the world life by wedding it to the self, or more simply, to teach to see, for that, as Conrad maintained, is everything," end of quote. His second and more instrumental belief was that traditional writing instruction had missed the point by advocating the subordinate clause and the complex sentence, and that, quote, "we should concentrate instead on the sentence modifier or free modifiers," end of quote. And equally important to his approach to teaching writing was his concern with sound, as he noted that the rhythm of good modern prose comes about equally from the multiple tracking of coordinate constructions and the downshifting and backtracking of free modifiers. What a great description. Downshifting and backtracking of free modifiers. If you'll think back to those cumulative sentences I read just a moment ago, you can hear that their rhythm is indeed one of downshifting and backtracking. The free modifiers point back to the base clause and shift down to a greater level of detail or specificity. They backtrack by picking up and expanding on some aspect of the base clause, giving the sentence, as Kristensen points out, quote, "a flowing and ebbing movement, advancing to a new position and then pausing to consolidate it, leaping and lingering, as the popular ballad does," end of quote. Kristensen seems to have found inspiration for his approach to the cumulative sentence in a little-known essay by the novelist and educator John Erskine. A longtime professor of literature at Columbia Erskine had been largely responsible for the development of Columbia's signature humanities course, a great books course that has been the model for many general education literature courses across the country. In 1946, Erskine had contributed an essay, The Craft of Writing, to a collection of essays titled 20th Century English, edited by William S. Knickerbocker. Neither Erskine's essay nor the collection in which it appeared is remembered much today. But in his essay, Erskine struck a note that served as the foundation for Kristensen's theory of the cumulative sentence. Almost as a throwaway observation, Erskine wrote, "Let me suggest here one principle of the writer's craft which, though known to practitioners, I have never seen discussed in print. The principle is this. When you write, you make a point not by subtracting as though you sharpened a pencil, but by adding. When you put one word after another, your statement should be more precise the more you add. If the result is otherwise, you've added the wrong thing, or you've added more than was needed." Erskine then noted that while grammar loosely concedes that speech is a process of addition, it then confuses things by making it seem that the substantive, nouns, or noun, since it can stand alone, is more important than the adjective, that the verb is more important than the adverb, that the main clause is more important than the subordinate. "Not so," wrote Erskine. "What you wish to say is found not in the noun, but in what you add to qualify the noun. The noun is only a grappling iron to hitch your mind to the reader's. The noun by itself adds nothing to the reader's information. It is the name of something he knows already, and if he does not know it, you cannot do business with him. The noun, the verb, and the main clause serve merely as a base on which meaning will rise. The modifier is the essential part of any sentence. In practice, therefore, the sentence proceeds from something the reader may be expected to know already toward whatever new thing we wish to tell him. We proceed by addition." And in a wonderfully sly swipe at those writing gurus who put all their weight behind omitting all modifiers and confining ourselves to nouns, pronouns, and verbs, Erskine notes that, quote, "The best tombstone and monumental descriptions follow this style, but here it should be noted the intention is to commemorate, to remind, rather than to say anything new." From Erskine's observation about the importance of adding information through the use of modifiers, Kristensen developed 4 principles for understanding and writing cumulative sentences. And he emphasized that these principles were intended as a heuristic, as a prompt to the writer to inspire more effective writing, rather than as rules for writing that was simply utilitarian and error-free. In this way, he saw his approach to the cumulative sentence as a generative rhetoric, a means of spurring on and producing better sentences. His first principle is that composition is essentially a process of addition. To a base clause such as "they turned on the radio," we add information such as ceaselessly turning the dial back and forth, trying to find a clear station, hoping for some news of the election. The second principle is that the information we add to sentences in modifying phrases gives the sentence a direction of modification or a direction of movement. As Kristensen explains, quote, "The main clause, which may or may not have a sentence modifier before it, advances the discussion, but the additions move backward, as in this clause, to modify the statement of the main clause, or more often to explicate or exemplify it, so that the sentence has a flowing and ebbing movement, advancing to a new position and then pausing to consolidate it, leaping and lingering as the popular ballad does." End of quote. This principle of direction of modification has sometimes been suggested by others who use the term left branching sentence to describe modification that comes to the left of or before the main clause, or right branching sentence to describe modification that comes to the right of or after the main clause. In the left branching sentence, the movement of modification is forward. In the right branching sentence, it is backward. The cumulative sentence makes good use of both movements, but the cumulative sentences Kristensen focuses the most attention on have modifiers that generally point or move backward. As he puts it, the additions stay with the same idea, probing its bearings and implications, exemplifying it, or seeking an analogy or metaphor for it, or reducing it to details. Thus, the mere form of the sentence generates ideas. It serves the needs of both the writer and the reader. The writer by compelling him to examine his thought, the reader by letting him into the writer's thought. I'd put this a bit differently, noting that the cumulative form urges the writer to give more information to the reader, and it suggests to the reader that the writer is doing her or his best to make things as clear and as satisfying as possible. This is a syntax that sends the signal that the writer is doing her or his level best to communicate fully and effectively, trying harder than other writers. The third principle is that cumulative sentences tend to develop by downshifting through increasingly detailed or specific levels of generality or levels of abstraction. Several lectures ago, I noted that every word in a sentence is chosen from an imaginary vertical or paradigmatic axis along which each word is more precise than a number of alternate choices above it on the ladder of abstraction and less precise than choices below it. Cumulative sentences tend to extend this principle to the entire sentence, usually modifying the base clause with a phrase that gives it more precision, and then frequently downshifting once again to a second level modifying phrase that adds precision to the first one. As Kristensen explains this, quote, "With the main clause stated, the forward movement of the sentence stops. The writer shifts down to a lower level of generality or abstraction or to singular terms and goes back over the same ground at this lower level." End of quote. We can see how this principle operates in a sentence where the base clause introduces a compound subject and subsequent modifying clauses break it down into its constituent parts, as in, "They sat down, the young man cautiously, as if he might decide not to sit at all, the young woman hurriedly, as if this were something she wanted to finish as quickly as possible." Or we can see it in a sentence in which each new layer, remember that each new layer or modifying phrase can be thought of as a step the sentence takes, as each new step refines the information of the preceding step. This room looks like a disaster area, its walls pocked with holes, holes that suggest the room had been the site of a violent fight, a fight in which sledgehammers had been the weapons of choice. Or, using a rough form of diagramming to indicate sentence levels with the base clause always the first level, we might write, "Cumulative sentences can take any number of forms, detailing both frozen or static scenes and moving processes, their insistent rhythm always asking for another modifying phrase, allowing us to achieve ever greater degrees of specificity and precision, a process of focusing the sentence in much the same way a movie camera can focus and refocus on a scene, zooming in for a close-up to reveal almost microscopic detail, panning back to offer a wide-angle panorama, offering new angles or perspectives from which to examine a scene or consider an idea. Kristensen's fourth principle is that cumulative sentences add texture to the propositional content of a sentence. You may remember that one of the key assumptions underlying this course is my belief that greater texture or density of information is one of the most important keys to better writing. The plain style that has been the goal of so much writing instruction is a style that devalues texture in favor of simplicity. Kristensen notes, quote, "The writing of most of our students is thin, even threadbare. But if he adds frequently or much or both to his nouns, verbs, and main clauses, the texture may be said to be dense or rich. One of the marks of an effective style, especially in narrative, is variety in the texture varying with the change in pace, the variation in texture producing the change in pace. In our classes, we have to work for greater density and variety in texture, and greater concreteness and particularity in what is added." End of quote. The cumulative sentence encourages us to do exactly this, and pretty much without stopping to think about what we need to do. Kristensen points to a striking example of this kind of texture in a magnificent sentence by Loren Eiseley that warns of unbridled atomic power, developing that warning through 6 memorable levels of generality, producing a sentence that unfolds in 11 distinct steps. "It is with the coming of man that a vast hole seems to open in nature, a vast black whirlpool spinning faster and faster, consuming flesh, stones, soil, minerals, sucking down the lightning, wrenching power from the atom, until the ancient sounds of nature are drowned out in the cacophony of something which is no longer nature, something instead which is loose and knocking at the world's heart, something demonic and no longer planned, escaped, it may be, spewed out of nature, contending in a final giant's game against its master." And there you have it, a generative rhetoric of the cumulative sentence based on just 4 principles: addition, movement, levels of generality, and texture. Consider the cumulative syntax in the terms of the steps suggested by Josephine Miles, and we get the idea of a sentence that takes a new step with each modifying phrase we add, that adds a new level or degree of specificity or clarity with each of these steps. Consequently, we can start thinking about improving the effectiveness of our sentences just by adding a single new modifying level, by making our sentences more effective still with each new modifying level we add beyond that. Kristensen said of his own teaching, quote, "I try in narrative sentences to push to level after level, not just 2 or 3, but 4, 5, or 6, even more, as far as the students' powers of observation will take them. I want them to become sentence acrobats, to dazzle by their syntactic dexterity." End of quote. I couldn't agree more. What a great goal for writers, to become sentence acrobats, to dazzle by their syntactic dexterity. And what makes me such a fan of the cumulative syntax is that this goal can be achieved so easily just by practicing the basic moves of the cumulative sentence until we internalize its rhythms and start to produce them without thinking. In the next 2 or 3 lectures, I'll be focusing specifically on those rhythms, on the basic moves we can make with cumulatives. For now, I just want to leave you with their sound, with how easy this syntax makes it for us to add information to our sentences, to make them longer, but to make them more satisfying as we do so. The following examples are sentences composed by students over the years, and they are sentences of which any writer should be proud. They sat down at the table, he resignedly slumping into the straight-backed chair, his tired face a picture of dejection, his hands shaking uncontrollably, she stiffly taking her seat with exaggerated formality, her eyes cold and hard and locked on his, her thin-lipped smile at once triumphant and condescending. The table piled high with stock reports and financial statements, its surface completely covered with documents of desperation, its jumble of information now completely useless, the overall scene suggesting an abandoned battleground. Here's another. Monique went down the stairs, walking on tiptoe, trying to keep her weight evenly distributed, trying not to touch the walls, muttering, "Vector forces," breathing in sharply every time she heard a noise, hoping desperately that the building was not going to collapse. And another. He stepped up to home plate, the chalk lines barely visible, wiping the sweat from his face, taking one last deep breath of the crisp autumn air, a look of determination in his eyes, the crowd rhythmically chanting his name, knowing that he represented the last ray of hope for his team. Another one. We navigated Nashville's back roads, whooping ourselves hoarse up and over the hills, feeling our weight alternately light and heavy in our seats, leaning right and left as the roads forked, wondering if we would ever escape the shade of the trees, laughing at the clock, longing for the North Star. Or, a lamp was burning on the table, flickering slightly, casting a dim light on the shabby room, leaving the corners dark, providing no comfort to the lonesome inhabitant of this shelter, promising him nothing. She called him, picking up the phone, hoping he would be home, scared of what he would say, praying that they would work things out, wishing he'd call her first, trying to get a grip on her emotions. And here's an even cooler thing about cumulatives. They build upon each other, setting up an insistent rhythm among as well as within sentences. Here are just a couple of examples of what I refer to as cumulative clumps, several cumulative sentences in a row that feed on each other, build on each other. I asked my students to use some of these cumulative clumps to write about crying, and here's some of what I got. I forced the knife through the onion, exposing its flesh, releasing a distinct aroma into my hallway of a kitchen. Seconds later, my eyeballs began to burn, tiny fires blazing each time I blinked, a watery film coating the insides of my eyelids, my vision blurred, causing me to blindly put down the knife, leaving me no option other than to stumble to the freezer and stick my entire head inside, remembering the onion remedy I once saw in a magazine. Here's another. The little girl is standing in the aisle, hands on hips, foot tapping, bottom lip twitching up and down with her brow scrunched together, her small arms wrapping themselves as far around the doll, still in the box, as possible. Slowly, one by one, tiny tears roll out of the corners of her eyes, bright blue eyes staring up at her father. The tears start out quiet, almost silent, quickly turning into a foot-stomping tantrum, doll on the ground, arms smacking the sides of her thighs, ponytail flopping as her head rocks back and forth. The tears, having stopped somewhere in the middle, have turned to an all-encompassing fit of rage. And finally, the old man waited for the music to begin, gazing over the crowd, his eyes meeting none of theirs, shifting his weight from hip to hip. With the first notes of the procession reverberating off the high ceiling, he took the first steps down the long aisle, the crowd now standing, faces turning, smiling eyes meeting, pouring into one another, a sensation of weightlessness growing in his stomach, engulfing his chest, clutching his throat, inhaling only short, stilted huffs as though anticipating a sneeze. Procuring a handkerchief, he dabbed the perspiration from his forehead and the tears from the tip of his nose, walking with his granddaughter, the bride-to-be. The writers of these sentences have learned some of the seductive secrets of cumulative syntax, and now you know too.